Mr. Jones, we do not have a quorum, so we're just going to go with the meeting. We can vote on the minutes and all the other items once Ms. Sanchez joins.
Okay.
Okay.
So as a matter of order, then let's see. Call to
I'll do
order the
my,
morning
yes.
of the Real Assets Committee here for LACERA on Wednesday, June 8th. So
I'll jump in.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
You just want to go to
I'm just going to read
roll?
yeah. So thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Jones. This meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting, so we'll do a roll call of the trustees to confirm attendance. Mr. Jones?
Here.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Knox are absent. Ms. Sanchez? Not yet. Mr. Kehoe?
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Green? Mrs. Jones? Okay. I think Ms. Sanchez just joined.
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Thank you. Ms. Greenwood and Mr. Santos.
Present.
Okay, staff participating in the meeting include the following: CIO John Grable, CEO Santos Crayman, Chief Counsel Stephen Rice. Investment staff include James Rice, Scott Drazel, and Cindy Rivera. And the consultants are Makita Investment Group, Stepstone Group, and the Alborn team. Trustees, please use the Zoom chat option to be placed in this queue. At this time, we ask all meeting participants to mute their mics until you're ready to speak. And now we may proceed with the agenda.
Okay, so welcome, Gina. So we can now, I have to do less scrambling around the official stuff and maintain the usual order. Can we go ahead and do the approval, motion for the approval of the minutes?
I'll move it.
I'll move it.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, great. Would you call the roll on that, Linda, for us?
Sure. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez?
Aye.
Okay, and Mr. Kehoe?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
All right, great. Do we have any public comment for today?
We do not.
All right. I miss the good old days when we used to have the comments here for stuff. Okay, so then non-consent items, we've got recommendations submitted by the staff team on 2 items. Jim, did you want to go ahead and introduce those? I think Scott's doing one, and Jim, you're doing the second one. Or I might have it flipped.
So the first item is the affiliation recommendation by for the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And Scott and Cindy are going to cover this item. So Scott, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, Chair Jones and trustees. As Jim mentioned, item 4A is a recommendation that the committee advance to the Board of Investments for its approval that LACERA affiliate to the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which is also known as GRESB, and sometimes it's pronounced as GRESB. So you'll hear both of those. This recommendation is a follow-up to the committee's January meeting, at which we gave an overview of several strategies that LACERA has been pursuing to integrate material ESG factors into the fund's real assets investment process. One of those strategies has been to do a trial affiliation with GRESB over the past 2 years to assess whether it might be a useful tool to help integrate ESG into LACERA's real assets program and further strategic objectives that we've got to enhance operational effectiveness and fund stewardship. Cindy and I will use the slide deck that's attached to your materials today to walk through some of the background on GRESB as well as the rationale for today's recommendation. So I'm going to jump ahead here to slide 3. Slide 3 references that GRESB was formed over a decade ago. It was established by a couple of Dutch pension plans, the big APG and PGGM, as well as asset managers to come up with a common set of ESG reporting metrics and enable asset owners and their managers to benchmark their performance against those metrics. It was intended as a means to facilitate meaningful ESG reporting between managers and real estate investors and expand beyond, sometimes anecdotal or qualitative reports on what managers are doing to integrate ESG to arrive at more consistent, comparable, and measurable performance indicators. Our trial affiliation with GRESB for the past 2 years has not required any affiliation fees, but GRESB is extending an offer for LACERA to continue to have access and participate without cost for the next couple of years, after which its annual affiliation fees are anticipated to cost about $20,000 per year. As we'll detail, we think GRESB has been, and if we affiliate, would continue to be a constructive and additive tool for our investment process. It complements the due diligence we do of all mandates by adding a quantitative lens and facilitates benchmarking of mandates, thereby helping to monitor existing managers and underwrite prospective new mandates. We think it also facilitates reporting from managers on a number of core ESG metrics like energy efficiency that can feed into our broader total fund portfolio analytics for a wider view and insights on several metrics. All of which we think would position us to further enhance operational effectiveness and stewardship in line with the board's stated strategic work plan. So I'm going to go to slide 4. Slide 4 presents some additional background information. The key points here include how GRESB basically works, which is that the asset managers gather and report on ESG data of their portfolio holdings in an annual reporting exercise. GRESB then analyzes and benchmarks that data and avails the results to asset owners like LACERA who signed up for access. GRESB benchmarks the data on a like-for-like basis. So mandates are benchmarked according to their strategy, regional exposure, and other attributes. As noted here, GRESB's grown a lot since its founding. Currently, there are over 2,200 separate funds that report to GRESB, and about 140 institutional investors involved, including CalPERS and New York State Common Retirement Fund, for example. As noted in the graphic in the middle of the slide there, on the left side, we've had a trial affiliation for the past 2 years, during which we encouraged all of LACERA's real estate managers to report and participate. 8 managers did participate, and Cindy's going to go over the insights from that trial shortly. On the right side of the graphic, we note that GRESB has also worked in recent years to establish a similar benchmarking framework for infrastructure, where LACERA's got a more recent asset allocation. Here we note that several of the private funds that LACERA is committed to in recent years also report to GRESB. So if the board approves, the committee and the board approves affiliation, we'd anticipate using GRESB for both real estate and infrastructure. I'm going to go on to slide 5, which gives an overview of our history with GRESB, which actually dates back to 2018 after the board adopted investment beliefs which addressed ESG factors in our investment program. Following adoption of those investment beliefs in 2016, we started exploring practical and meaningful avenues by which we could operationalize and incorporate ESG throughout the investment process for each asset class. GRESB had stood out as a prospective tool in real assets, which prompted our exploration of this trial affiliation and evaluation, which ultimately leads to today's recommendation. So jumping into some of the results, on slide 6, this is a snapshot of the overall year-over-year performance from the 2-year trial affiliation of the 8 managers that did participate. I'm going to turn it over to Cindy now, who's going to walk through the insights more closely.
Thanks, Scott. As mentioned, a total of 8 LACERA managers reported to GRESB on LACERA mandates in the US, Europe, and Asia. These managers included a mix of both separate accounts and commingled funds and represented about half of LACERA's total real estate net asset value. The chart on this slide shows light blue bars that represent manager scores in 2020. Dark blue bars represent manager scores the following year in 2021, and the yellow circles represent each mandate's peer average for each year. We note that 6 of 8 mandates demonstrated year-over-year improvement, and the remaining 2 mandates maintained their prior year score. Relative to peers with similar sector and geographic exposure, 2 mandates outperformed, while the remainder either underperformed or were in line with peers. In addition to the ESG scores for each mandate illustrated in the bar chart, GRESB allows us to consolidate reporting and see how LACERA's overall portfolio performs against a similarly constructed portfolio model. On an asset-weighted basis, LACERA's total GRESB score at 74 of 100 possible points is slightly lower than the average score of similar portfolios. There is room for improvement on ESG performance, and with GRESB affiliation, we would expect to gain greater insight and clarity regarding needed modifications. As part of our assessment of GRESB, we met with each of the managers who reported to GRESB to review their results, delve into detailed ESG performance metrics, and we got their their candid insights on the usefulness of participating in GRESB. On the next slide, we share some of the takeaways from these meetings. Consistently, managers reported having found the experience useful in not only benchmarking ESG performance against peers, but also in identifying areas for improvement from year 1 to year 2. Managers' improvement efforts so far have included a number of meaningful changes such as enhancing and automating data collection in the spirit of what gets measured gets managed. Some managers indicated they'd look to include so-called green language in new tenant leases. This new so-called green language secures tenant buy-in upfront and facilitates collection of tenant-controlled data. Several have added dedicated ESG resources and staff to formalize ESG integration practices, and they're creating a firm-wide task forces to align resources. Notably, each manager has indicated that it intends to continue reporting to GRESB and collaborating with us to move the needle on ESG. Next slide, please. In addition to reviewing the ESG performance of each mandate, we also want to highlight that by participating in GRESB, we can gain access to specific metrics and analytics that GRESB gathers on core ESG indicators, such as actual energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, and waste management. For example, by encouraging managers to report to GRESB, we gained insights on the greenhouse gas emissions of reporting mandates, which represent about half or 54% of the reporting LACERA real estate portfolio. Greater data collection coverage continues to be a focus. By looking at quantitative data, we can look at comparisons and trend lines, such as the change in consumption levels for like investments. From year 1 to year 2, we see improvement in some categories and muted changes in others. It is important to note this data reflects only a 1-year change and was likely impacted by exogenous events, namely the COVID-19 pandemic. But we wanted to highlight that if we proceed with affiliating to GRESB, LACERA would start to have these types of data points available for analysis to better identify trends and drivers of ESG performance. Next slide, please. GRESB affiliation is beneficial on many fronts. Via ESG performance management, LACERA can further its strategic goals of ESG integration and intentional improvement of long-term risk-adjusted returns. It is important to note content in the GRESB questionnaire is aligned with global sustainability reporting frameworks that LACERA is quite familiar with. Frameworks such as PRI, or the Principles for Responsible Investment, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, amongst others. Simply completing the GRESB assessment informs managers about ESG best practices and helps them identify prior blind spots. For LACERA staff, GRESB assessments have been a useful tool to better understand ESG performance at the asset level, managers' deliberate actions, and how they compare to peers. Affiliating to GRESB would also enable LACERA to incorporate GRESB performance into our underwriting process, adding more information to enhance diligence of new investment opportunities. On the next slide, we cite a couple of considerations to be mindful of. First, although we've had free access to GRESB for a couple of years, GRESB does anticipate starting to charge asset owners a nominal fee of about $20,000 per year. We believe this cost is nominal and in line with other affiliations LACERA has. Second, we view GRESB reporting as focused on meaningful ESG metrics, but it's conceivable that managers may try to game the benchmark by chasing points for the sake of points. However, we note that GRESB's benchmarking scale is focused on metrics formulated by an industry advisory council, meaning the metrics are designed to be more investor relevant. Moreover, 70% of the GRESB score is driven by objective metrics focused on whether managers measure quantitative ESG performance data, such as actual energy consumption, GHG emissions, water usage, and waste. This data is validated by a quality control process that was developed by PwC, all of which gives us comfort that the reporting scale would be meaningful and useful for us as an end user. On the next and final slide, we recommend that LACERA formally affiliate to GRESB. As discussed, staff believes that formal affiliation and continued participation in GRESB is aligned with LACERA's investment beliefs, strategic goals, and enhances our portfolio management and underwriting abilities. We'd recommend that the committee advance affiliation to the board for its approval and are happy to take any questions or comments you may have.
Great. With that, we welcome any questions or comments.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. In regards to how this looks when you're comparing investment returns, have we seen any impact on that?
So we, in the trial affiliation, the stronger performance lied within some of the commingled funds over the separate accounts, and perhaps I'm not sure if Jim wants to comment. We haven't done a tight correlation, cause and effect. It's a broader approach on understanding, to what extent managers are identifying key ESG metrics and measuring and hopefully advancing on meaningful improvements. But Jim, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think Cindy has the slide that showed our relative performance relative to our peers for the managers that did participate. It is asset weighted, so that when you look at our overall score relative to our peers, we did have slightly lower ESG score. However, when you look at performance, I don't know that it's as strong of a correlation at this point. We have a kind of a limited number of funds to look at to compare our performance just on this basis. Hopefully with the enhanced alignment with GRESB, we'll be in a position to correlate performance with these results.
Yeah, because I'm all about information is always good, and $20,000 or whatever that is not a whole bunch of money to look at it. But when you're looking at the starting to focus on this or realign some of our investments to focus on improving our score, that's going to start driving our investments themselves. And I would like to see that there's an actual investment return growth based on this, rather than us chasing higher numbers and then ultimately having a negative impact on our investment returns. So I think when we frame this discussion, everything should start with how this impacts our investment returns. Even when you're looking at ESG related issues, we should be looking at how that impacts the overall investment returns for the portfolio, for the whole system. So when we invest this to the full board, it might be good to throw a slide in there or to discuss what we've seen. I know we have a very limited pool, only 8 overall involved managers, but it would be interesting to see how that is and to have a focus on that as we proceed, especially if we're looking at joining and if other managers are joining, and if we start chasing this, I'd like to see that there's an actual positive investment return. That's it.
Mr.
Thank you,
Keel,
Trustee
appreciate
Kehoe. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
my apologies. Appreciate the comment. I think what we're finding in dialogues with managers is you're focusing on what specifically are they identifying as areas for improvement, and how do they consider those to be meaningful from a materiality point of view? How could they impact performance? A couple of examples have been an increased focus on measuring energy efficiency, for example, and working with tenants with the theory that the more efficient their energy usage is, the more it would decrease operating costs, for example, which could translate to the bottom line. Another example is on certification programs. Some of the managers have reported that they're exploring areas to gain certifications, which raises a question, I think, to the point on our managers chasing points for the sake of points. And the observations that we're hearing is that by obtaining certifications, it better positions managers for market premiums in certain markets, or avoids the risk of a brown discount in leases, by which if buildings are not certified, they may be less attractive to prospective tenants. So we're to the observation that more data allows us to analyze that. I think it's, in addition to just analyzing the data, it's also opening up dialogue and opportunities for deeper probing with the managers of what specifically are they focused on that's related to performance and improved costs.
John, you, and then Herman, I see you, and then right after John.
Mr. Santos can go first.
Okay, go ahead, Trustee Santos.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grable. Actually, I was looking forward to your comments, but I support Mr. Keogh's comments and concerns. I'm also in favor of getting information. Information is good, but our ultimate goal here, to paraphrase Mr. Keogh, is returns. We need to make sure that those returns do not get minimized. So I would like to join Mr. Keogh in requesting that at least some analysis be done that would reflect that this would not in any way minimizes or causes our managers to minimize the zeal to get us the maximum return. Because all this is wonderful as a collateral piece. I get that, but I just wanted to say that. I don't know if Mr. Grable can shed some light on that, but that's how I feel. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair and Mr. Kehoe, my perspective for the committee and then the board's ultimate consideration is that this is a tool. It's a component, not the dominant component of how we A, underwrite investments, then B, monitor investments. So the more information we have, the more informed we are as it relates to new prospective investments and existing investments, and whether we continue to work with that partner or look to move capital elsewhere. I think it's too early with only 54% or just above half our assets reporting to draw conclusions. But I think one thing that may be telling on this slide is that our score is slightly lower than an average. Our returns are slightly below peers. So maybe there is some correlation, or that may just be incomplete data. But we can always choose, if it's not helpful in the future, to unaffiliate.
Any other questions, response to the GRESB or GRES, depending upon perhaps your European pronunciation, silent B, to the report?
Mr. Jones, if I may, just wanted to add some context as well from our manager conversations. We did find that managers were very thoughtful about at the asset level what type of changes would be made to help drive some of this ESG performance. So that is at the core of consideration when managers and LACERA are having those conversations about what changes to make whether or not to pursue green certifications, insight gained from tenant surveys. So focus is two-pronged, really at trying to improve the top level and having this increase or attract greater rents, and also have it be a means of controlling cost over the long term. So quite at the center of these conversations, and definitely the biggest area of focus.
Okay. I see Trustee Jones has a comment as well.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. You know, I guess my opinion is a little bit on the not quite in line. I know investment returns are very important to the portfolio, and I understand that. I think this GRESB tool looks like it's something that LACERA has done due diligence with. It's done proper research. And I think it has proven to be somewhat beneficial, as giving us another tool in evaluating performance. And so, you know, I just wanted to comment that, you know, I believe that, you know, part of the efforts that LACERA has put forward to improve ESG performance and look at these type of things, this is in line with the commitment that I understand that has been placed out there, which, you know, not only involves investment return, but also other aspects of the investment spectrum. And so I just wanted to comment that I think that it is a great tool, and I hope that this is something that proves to be beneficial as time goes on, and we can monitor the scores where we are today and maybe possibly where we are a year from now and further out, just to be able to have a, you know, a benchmark and a measure for improving that score.
All right, thank you, Trustee Jones. Any other comments? We got ample time. We only have one more report if anyone wanted to comment further on this.
We'll go motion to move it forward with just the request that we do expand and tie this into discussions about overall investment returns.
Okay.
I'll second.
Second, good. Let's go ahead and have a vote. Linda, please.
Okay, Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Okay, Ms. Sanchez?
Aye.
Thank you. And Mr. Kehoe?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
All right, next consent item for the team is the responsible contractor policy and the update or revision to that. Jim
And yes, Scott will be leading this discussion.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you again, Chair Jones, members of the committee, trustees. As mentioned on the agenda, item 4B is a recommendation for the committee to advance for the board's review and approval a revised responsible contractor policy. It's commonly referred to as an RCP, so we're throwing out a lot of acronyms this morning. This item is an additional follow-up to the committee's January meeting, at which we reported on, you know, a number of those ESG strategies to try to integrate ESG in a meaningful way in the real assets portfolio. And we'd indicated that we'd follow up on some possible proposed revisions as part of our work plan this year. So I'm going to go to slide 2. I'll use the deck, which is in the committee's materials, as attachment 1, to talk through what prompted the policy review and the objectives we had in revisiting the RCP. I'm then going to summarize and give an overview of the refinements that are reflected in the draft revision, which is in the committee's materials as attachment 2. First, let's start by level setting what the RCP is intended to do. By way of background, LACERA's investment beliefs and strategy, as laid out in our investment policy statement, state that ESG factors might impact investment risks and opportunities, risk return profiles. So to the extent that we can identify and mitigate ESG risks or opportunities, hopefully that enhances risk-adjusted returns. LACERA has had an RCP in place for about 20 years to guide the real estate portfolio's separate account managers in soliciting and selected contracted building construction services and other building operations, such as cleaning and security guards, for example. The basic aim is to protect and enhance returns by encouraging high road contracting by calling on asset managers to review prospective bidders, contractors' history of legal compliance, workplace safety, track record, and a number of aspects of their employment practices. In doing so, the aim of RCPs are to seek avoiding so-called low road bidders who might expose LACERA's investments to regulatory actions, labor instability, unsafe working conditions, all of which could prompt project delays, cost money, and pose related reputational risks on LACERA. Also, it's intended to discourage contractors from competing with each other by undercutting local wage practices and reducing employee benefits, for example. In slide 5, we highlight some of the reasons for the policy review. First, we think it's prudent practice to periodically review policies to ensure they're serving LACERA's objectives. The current RCP is based in large part on an industry template that was developed and adopted by a number of pension plans 20 years ago. It may be worth assessing possible updates to ensure it's calibrated to the board's current objectives and portfolio. Second, we note that the portfolio here at LACERA has evolved since LACERA first adopted the RCP, largely in its current form. For example, the RCP currently only covers real estate, but we've expanded real assets into infrastructure and natural resources. The structure reviews that have been approved by the committee and the board also call on increasing exposures through commingled funds, as opposed to separate accounts where we have 100% equity ownership. And lastly, we note that in the slide that in recent years, a number of our peer plans, as well as asset managers, have updated RCPs, moving to version 2.0 from that industry template from about 20 years ago. For the most part, those version 2.0 has just added more clarity to a number of terms. So across the bottom, you'll note the project timeline, which included research into RCP policies and practices in the market to identify possible gaps in the policy and allow us to consider, is it worth adding those? We've engaged with peers on were there any unintended consequences on language they adopted, for example, or detrimental impact. And we also consulted closely with our legal office to develop the draft that's before the committee today to aim to ensure that the draft benefited from legal insights and interpretations. So I'll move on to slide 6, which highlights the 5 objectives we had in putting together the draft that's before the committee's review. First, we sought to align the RCP scope of coverage with LACERA's current real assets allocation by identifying and addressing increased allocations to new areas like infrastructure as well as commingled funds. Second, we aim to identify any gaps between our policy and market practices at peers, which largely meant adding additional clarity to a number of previously or currently undefined terms and provisions. Third, LACERA's work to create greater policy cohesion in recent years. We've consolidated policies together to revise and update the investment policy statement, for example. We harmonized a number of corporate governance policies into one governance and stewardship principles. And the RCP has been a standalone policy without any reference to the IPS, for example. So in drafting this RCP for the committee's review, we aim to incorporate cross-references to try to create a more cohesive investment policy framework going forward. Fourth, we aim to promote transparency and ensure that as a public-facing document, it's written with plain language to the extent possible and clear terms so that anyone reading it can get a gist of what it says. And fifth, as the trustees are aware, LACERA's investment division strategic work plan aims to aspire to exemplary investment policies and practices. So we targeted a work product that could reflect that aspiration. I'm going to break down each of these objectives in the next couple of slides, starting on slide 8, in which we highlight the key ways where we've adjusted the scope of coverage to try to align with the real assets portfolio as it exists today. In the first row, trustees will note that the current policy only covers real estate investments. The draft revision is expanded to include all real assets, including infrastructure and natural resources. So it's a wall-to-wall coverage policy that's before the committee. In the second row, the current policy technically only covers separate accounts in which LACERA holds 100% equity. In reality, LACERA may have separate accounts that LACERA controls, but there may be a JV with a minority interest. So technically the policy doesn't apply, although those separate account managers have cooperated with the RCP. We also noted that peer plans require asset managers to abide by their RCP provisions where they control the fund, which is generally defined as more than 50% ownership. So the draft mirrors that adjustment to say the RCP provisions are required where LACERA controls the investment, which is defined as a greater than 50% equity stake. In the third row, at the bottom of the slide, we also highlight that the current policy does not give any reference or coverage to commingled funds where we've got increasing exposure, both in real estate as well as infrastructure and other areas. We've noted that several peer plans have incorporated language that although they don't control those commingled funds, they encourage commingled funds to abide by the RCP terms. So there's been a movement in the market to try to define and articulate expectations of commingled funds. Here too, we've incorporated language that would encourage non-controlled funds to apply RCP standards, as well as adopt RCPs of their own if they don't have them. We note that more asset managers have actually developed their own RCPs at this point in the marketplace. And it's already part of our due diligence on for commingled funds. So that's the coverage of some changes in the scope of coverage. I'll move on to slide 9, which summarizes some of the clarifications we tried to build into the proposed revised policy. For example, the current policy encourages fair wages and benefits, but does not have any language or definition of what constitutes fair. The real assets portfolio, as the committee is aware, covers a lot of diverse regional labor markets and construction trades. So it's very difficult for funds to define a specific metric. So instead, the draft policy pulls from peer plans that identify factors that asset managers might consider when evaluating what constitutes fair wages and benefits. For example, it gives reference to are there employer-sponsored benefits? Does the employer provide safety training, for example? That language is intended to encourage high road practices and deter contracting practices that might incent cost cutting by reducing benefits, for example. The current policy also requires legal compliance with all applicable local, state, and federal laws. We noted peers have added prohibitions from using contractors who've been debarred by a government agency or whose principal has been debarred. That language, we understand, is intended to avoid fly-by-night operations that might get shut down by a regulatory agency, but then reopen under a new name. Another clarification added is that the current policy encourages competitive bidding. We heard from peers and stakeholders that in order to encourage competitive bidding, bidders want to know that the opportunities to bid exist. So language has been added to peers that's mirrored in the draft that encourages adequate advance notice where feasible and practical on bidding opportunities. So to be clear, a lot of language on the terms on this page were mirroring policies at plans like Maryland, Oregon, CalPERS that have revised or adopted terms in recent years. And we've been told that these provisions haven't had a detrimental impact and in fact have clarified. So I'm going to move on to slide 10. In this slide, to promote policy cohesion, we've added new guiding introduction that frames the RCP as an extension of LACERA's IPS and investment beliefs. It now states high-level guiding principles, referencing our stewardship principles, such as legal compliance, human rights, constructive human capital practices, that encourage all asset managers to practice, or we encourage all asset managers to practice, And then it details the specific RCP provisions in real assets. The current policy has limited language on prohibiting discrimination in contracting, which we've expanded to reflect the IPS's broader definition of diversity, as well as approach to encouraging inclusive workplace practices as productive business. And whereas the current policy has isolated prescriptive measures for manager implementation, we considered that LACERA has expanded and modernized a lot of our manager monitoring and compliance practices in the last 20 years since the RCP was first adopted, including refreshing our reporting to the board as exemplified in this month's quarterly performance report. So we thought the RCP should be part of that more comprehensive and holistic monitoring, and the revised policy seeks to therefore elevate and integrate RCP monitoring into the LACERA's broader compliance practices for the board's oversight. RCP now calls for routine and comprehensive monitoring, including furnishing reports to the board for your review. Slide 11, to promote transparency and reading comprehension, we sought to use plain language, clarify terms, avoid vernacular where we could, and simplify the policy structure to something that reflects LACERA's use of it, as opposed to adopting an external template format as it is. These modifications resulted in more revisions, frankly, than we initially anticipated across the investment office and legal. So for the sake of clarity, we've provided a clean copy for the trustees' review, but we did not provide a red line in consultation with legal counsel, since it would be pretty difficult to follow at this point. In slide 12, beyond just updating the policy to reflect the current portfolio and market practices, we challenged ourselves to try to reflect LACERA's ambitions to try to put forward our best product consistent with the strategic work plan to be best in class. Here we highlight a couple features that we think are worth noting for the revision. First, the policy before you is part of an integrated investment policy framework, which cross-references key policies like the IPS instead of being a standalone isolated RCP. It's framed by universally applicable aspirational guiding principles like legal compliance that we'd expect of all asset managers. We think it has comprehensive scope of coverage in a practical way where we have control or where we may not control investments in real assets, but we'd strongly encourage managers to abide by responsible contracting. It proactively incorporates DEI consistent with LACERA's IPS and tied efforts. We've tried to elevate manager accountability by calling on managers to report on how they adhere to RCP provisions, as well as integrate our own monitoring and compliance for the board's oversight. So with that, quick overview, we welcome comments and questions from trustees on the recommendation.
Okay, I know that Herman had a question.
Thank you very much, Scott. You said it, best in class. In my view, this policy represents best in class. Outstanding work is taking us many years to get here, but here we are. And this is a credit to the leadership of Mr. Grable, my colleagues on the board, and the staff. So I have two minor suggestions to include in the policy under section 4, key provisions of responsible contracting, and specifically on the B, legal compliance. I would like to respectfully recommend my colleagues adopt the following. As the last sentence in that paragraph should read, responsible contractors recognize the right of all workers to freedom of association in the workplace as protected under the local, state, and federal law, and as recognized by the International Labor Organization standards, the ILO. In the end, I will also respectfully would like to recommend the following addition for on the section 5 policy implementation, and more specifically on the D monitoring. That is actually, this will be in the middle of the paragraphs. It begins, LACERA reviews reports from investment managers of controlled investments regarding implementation and compliance with the terms and provisions of this policy and furnishes reports, comma, this is what I would like to propose, including an annual publicly available report on investment manager compliance with the policy. So those are the two recommendations that I would like to propose.
All right, so duly noted there. Scott or John, I know that you had legal go through this to kind of clean up and specify language there. Is in response to Herman's two comments there, and I don't know, I assume Mr. Rice is online. I'm not sure who from the legal team you may have worked with. Are the concerns that he has expressed in those two additions kind of embedded already in there, or is it truly adding new requirements from your perspective? I just want to make sure that we don't potentially propose something that the staff and the legal team feels is the right area of kind of purview there.
Well, jumping in from a legal perspective, certainly the second comment about Section 5 and the requirement of annual report, there would be no legal concerns with that. It's the committee and board have a duty to monitor. That's part of the fiduciary duty. So a provision that furthers that would not raise any legal concerns, and the investment staff can speak beyond that. As far as the addition of the statement recognizing freedom of association, the policy does take it does require for controlled investments neutrality on organizational issues, and in order to further the opportunity for workers to decide for themselves. I don't know that I think the language that is in the policy, which was discussed heavily among staff, I think that the current language does address this issue. I wouldn't say that I would have any legal objection to the addition of the language, but I think the core concept there is already reflected in the neutrality provision and other provisions of the policy. And Scott and may have comments as well on this.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, I see John that you.
Scott can go first.
Okay, go ahead, Scott.
Okay, I'll just offer some observations that consistent with Steve's comments, Mr. Rice's comments. In terms of reporting, I think that the suggestion is in line with staff's intent here, that we provide compliance reporting for the board's oversight, good governance practice. So I think that's consistent and perhaps adds just additional clarity to the intent beyond the policy to do exactly that. In terms of the freedom of association language, going back to the section on legal compliance, I think consistent with what Mr. Rice said, the language, the suggestion is aligned with a number of indirect and direct references. At the beginning of the policy, there's reference to respect for human rights. I think freedom of association is considered an international human rights standard. The language on legal compliance would be inclusive of abiding by labor laws, which I think is highlighted. And the neutrality language is more directly related to the same. So I think that the suggestion is consistent, and it would be a question for the committee on whether or not underscoring the specific provision as useful added clarity. So I think both are generally consistent with the policy as it's framed currently.
Chairman Santos, do you feel, at least on the first point, that the neutrality language is sufficient, or would you still like the some expression, additional expression of your initial comment to be a part of that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is consistent. This does not change the policy. This additive. It might be a little redundant, but I think in my view, it needs to be clear. So this is consistent with what we've been saying or what the policy is saying all along. And this is a conclusion of that be consistent with state and federal laws. I mean, that's what we want. So I will insist that both sections be included.
Okay, Captain Keogh. Trustee Keogh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. The question I just wanted to confirm with Mr. Grable that there's no issues with the public reporting of the compliance, that we can go ahead and do that. And assuming that there is not any concerns, which it doesn't sound like there was from Scott, then I would be in support of both of the modifications recommended by Mr. Santos. But I just want to hear from Mr. Grable before we make a motion or vote.
Thank you, Captain Kehoe. And you probably were reading my mind, because I was going to ask a question of Mr. Rice, which is on the monitoring. If this changes existing contracts, is this prospective, or do we try to adjust existing contracts? Steve, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. We'd have to evaluate the extent to which the policy with this change, and even without it, requires any contract modifications. I'm not sure that it will, but we should evaluate that. The language requiring the report isn't overly prescriptive in terms of content. So I think that confidentiality agreements and other privacy concerns and other legal issues would be included here, but the overall compliance with the policy would be addressed in a public report. So I think there's balance there.
Okay, so Gina, not to call you on the spot, but I know your inputs oftentimes is very clarifying. Did you have anything else to add to Herman's
No, I don't.
suggestion? Okay, great. All right, so then the
I'll
current
go
motion. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll go ahead and make a motion that we adopt the
Second.
revision with the recommended changes. But I do put the asterisks to have staff review the contractual elements when they present it to the full board.
Okay. So the roll, Linda?
Okay, Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Okay, Ms. Sanchez?
Aye.
Thank you, and Mr. Kehoe?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
All right, and then lastly, for any additional items for staff review?
I don't have anything.
Okay, good to the order. Before we break briefly, before the main meeting, any good to the order from trustees or staff? With there being none, this committee meeting is adjourned. I'll see you guys at 9.
Yeah.